So I guess we can move into the final third of the book, which is called The Storm. And this picks up right sort of after Martian Rowe takes a stand against some of his Tempest runners and sort of lays out the plan of what needs to happen. So he sent Kassav to sort of move into position to take on the Republic to sort of capture the black box while it's in transport. They're fairly outnumbered and definitely outgunned against the Republic pretty immediately because the Republic has a lot of Jedi, piloting ships that are with them, but they quickly start to fight dirty. The Nile does. They, release some like toxic stuff that they're carrying against ships, because it sort of catches them off. That's a pretty dishonorable way. They kind of get the jump on the Republic and Jedi ships from the start, even though some of their tactics are starting to hurt their own ships and damage their own people. As this is occurring, the ships from Uradu, who Kassav, who had, tried to extort earlier, show up and are not yet into the fight, but they're coming into range and making it clear that, hey, we want this guy, like this dude did us dirty. We're coming for blood. As this is happening, Lorna D is approaching Elfrona, where the rescue is happening, and Porter Engel and Adrena and Bell and Loden Greatstorm are each taking a person as they go. The Nile throw one of the kids out of the ship as it starts to that they've made it to the ship and they're starting to take off. They throw one of the kids out, and Bell sort of takes the kid. Loden and Adrena sort of make a maneuver to be able to sort of board the ship. With Adrena gets on the ship and takes out sort of the Nile on the ship and captures or rescues the other child that's being held hostage. And then Loden is sort of left to rescue the remaining hostage, the father of the family, the husband of the wife that they had rescued earlier, who's left on the ship as Lorna is approaching with her fleet and starts sort of shooting at his vector. He makes a crazy leap out of his vector into the ship that the Nile were escaping in and breaks his leg upon impact as he's sort of getting in there. As they're trying to escape, Lorna D, with their gas tactics, boards the ship and doesn't kill them with their gas, but instead sort of knocks them out and takes them both hostage. While this is going on back with Kassav, Martian Rowe contacts Kassav and basically takes over the fleet by encouraging what seems to be like random path jumps for the ships to sort of start to go in and out of hyperspace at random, seemingly to the Republic, and sort of gives them the edge, a further edge over the Republic. They're kind of just appearing, taking shots at ships, starting to kill off a lot of the Republic ships, and a lot of Jedi, it seems like, in this time, or that have been protecting the black box are being taken out. In this case, Master Joramali, who was intended to be, that we mentioned early, to be the Jedi Master of the Jedi Marshal of the Starlight Beacon, is actually killed. And this sort of is when Avar Kriss once again kind of melds the minds of Force users again to kind of focus on what the Nile are doing and where their ships are disappearing to and reappearing, and kind of starts to communicate that out to the other Jedi that are in their vectors and long beams and fighting them. And it pretty quickly turns the tide again once in the favor of the Jedi and the Republic, and leaves Kassav's fleet to sort of be decimated in the same way of the sort of pieces coming out with emergences that the Jedi are sort of there or Republic are there to sort of take them out as these ships are jumping in and out of hyperspace from the paths. They're kind of getting taken out by the different Republic ships that are in there. At this point, Martian Rowe contacts Kassav again and basically tells him that he's going to be a sacrifice to the Republic, and you kind of start to piece together Martian Rowe's plan a little bit more, that some of these things where he sent Lorna and Kassav to do these final tasks were a little more calculated than it seemed. And he basically starts to control their path engines to become suicide bombers and just start flying and appearing inside or right next to the Republic ships and do as much damage as they can. In the midst of this, Kassav's ship is boarded by Iridians, and he's, at this point is ready to turn on Martian Row and is ready to be like, hey, like, take me in, I'll spill the beans, and they just instantly kill him. And so he has no chance to fight back or turn on Martian. And that basically, concludes this last ditch effort for Kassav to try and reclaim the black box. And in some sense, the Republic thinks that knowing that Kassav was part of the Nile and that he had done this other stuff with Eradu, that, there's a pretty divisive sort of thought of whether the Nile might be gone for good or might have been defeated, or that there might be others, but maybe it's just remnants. So there's a little bit of celebration, like sort of that Kassav's been taken out, but there are definitely some that are a little hesitant to accept that the Nile, are completely eradicated and that this hyperspace incident, is over. Lorna D then returns to Martian Row with Loden Greatstorm. Martian Row basically claims Loden's lightsaber for himself and kind of assumes full control of the Nile. This is where we get a little bit of exposition that of his plan, and that basically everything occurred thus far in the book was kind of guided by Martian behind the scenes, that he knew that the ship that was in the path that caused or in the hyperspace lane via the path that caused the Legacy run was sort of done by a ship he'd kind of secretly stolen from one of his Tempests to go set out. He knew that there was a Jedi outpost on Elfrona, so when Lorna D was going to go kidnap and get this ransom family, his hope was that the Jedi would intervene and that somehow they might be able to capture a Jedi to have, on their side, that they could have captured for some longer term goal, we've yet to see. And then we also learned that with Mari Santeca, he hasn't just been mapping the paths around the Outer Rim for some of the stuff that they're doing. He secretly mapped, all the way into the core and beyond, and has paths that run throughout, potentially the full galaxy. And this is his sort of chance where he even takes off his mask, encourages the rest of the Nile to take off their mask, and kind of, uses the "We Are the Republic" against the Republic and says, "We are the Nihil," and basically pushes for a larger mass expansion of the Nile going forward now that they have this control, and now that he definitely feels like his Tempest runners are a little more under his thumb based on what he did to Kassav, and them sort of understanding that he had sort of been moving the pieces the whole way through. On the Republic side, because, the Nile isn't acting right away immediately after the loss of Kassav, there kind of is this moment of peace for them, where they think that the Nile might be eliminated. Jorah Mali's loss is definitely sort of felt within the Jedi, and Avar Kriss is chosen to lead the Starlight Beacon sort of in her stead. And then we do get sort of a few sequences where we get to see sort of where the Jedi are sort of leading up, and some of these main characters are sort of ending up at the end of this story as it starts to close, including things like Kevin Tarr going to work with the Santecas. So that character was so key in this book that it might be we'll get a little bit more of the Santecas and Kevin maybe in some other stories along the lines. But it basically, all culminates with this opening ceremony of the Starlight Beacon, where sort of it's a time of celebration, but also, they are definitely feeling the fact that they just had sort of probably one of the biggest losses, and definitely the biggest sort of, sense of evil in the galaxy for some time, that we've seen outside of, I think they call like the something of the Sith, Battle of the Sith, or something that they reference had happened like centuries before, that this was sort of the largest, more, evil skirmish they've had to deal with in a while.
Yep.
And then the book concludes with a little epilogue of Elzar Mann kind of having this nightmarish vision of sort of all these horrific things that are to come, that definitely foreshadows, where we might see the High Republic going forward.
Well, jumping, I think, into it from here, and good overview, Scott, because I think there was a lot of action in this final bit. It was definitely a shorter section, but a ton happened within it. I thought the way that Kassav was treated was pretty interesting just to begin with this. I think it was interesting the Republic thought that he was the Nihil to start with, and that kind of is gonna bite them for sure one day. But at the point that Marchion kind of takes over and speaks to the entire Tempest group that he has out there, I feel like the tables turned on Marchion's character and his power and premise for what he's trying to achieve. And the way that they start attacking by jumping in and out of hyperspace like that finally answered to me the question of like what scares the Jedi, because that was the premise they kept telling us this was. That would be pretty terrifying. And the fact that they were basically by the end suicide bombers coming in and out of hyperspace, which we did see the power of that, in Last Jedi, makes it pretty terrifying when you think of hundreds or thousands of these potentially occurring at once.
Yeah, I think one thing that was apparent in the path section of the book, the second section, and then the storm as well, is echoes what you're saying, Dan, of the like what scares the Jedi is the fact that the Nihil aren't Force users. We don't know what Mari Senteca, how she's able to map the path, but she's not a weapon per se, in terms of just directly attacking them. They're utilizing her skills to, influence the way they're able to attack, but they're not Force users. And I think, in where we kind of always assume that, the only thing that can take down a Jedi is, another Force user, a Sith or something like that, something of that level. But that the fact that you have this group that kind of appears out of nowhere and has this ability to take them out and then disappear and then take them out and disappear, I think is definitely interesting. And I think the other thing that was interesting that I didn't cover much in that summary, but is worth mentioning, is when Loden Greatstorm is held captive, he's being held captive amongst other prisoners that aren't meaningful in any way, but they're basically being tortured continuously so that their fear and their pain basically clouds Loden's, mind. And so that he's not able to reach out to Avar Kriss or any other Jedi to basically say, hey, this is where I'm being held captive, that they're basically using his Force abilities against him as a kind of a way to torture him, but also keep him hidden from the fact that he's been captured.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting too, Scott, and certainly kind of continued to uh, add layers to Martian's vileness. He continues to get worse and worse throughout the book. I really love that this section kind of paid off on a few things that they set up at the beginning of the book. With the you mentioned this, Scott, but the kind of continual work that Loden was doing with Bell and trying to get him to master this controlled fall, using the Force to, stop yourself and landing in a secure way. So Bell is put in this position where he has to save one of these settlers and is literally free falling from the atmosphere down to the planet below. It has to kind of fully kind of embrace the Force and learn that lesson through this really harrowing experience. I'd love to see that kind of play out, and that I think even more made the outcome for Loden being kind of kidnapped more painful for that character. And even at the dedication ceremony for Starlight, we see Bell kind of at this. And something we should mention is because Bell was able to kind of fall and do this, Loden, and I think their last exchange in the book tells Bell, you are now, able to become a Jedi Knight. And, as soon as we're done with this mission, I'm going to contact the council and let them know that you should be promoted. And obviously, Loden's kidnapped and Bell's kind of left in this very strange situation where he doesn't really want to be promoted unless Loden is there to kind of see him go through that ceremony. So it's a real heartbreaking moment. We have this triumph for a character we've been rooting for the whole book, and then that victory is kind of ripped away from him, and he's not able to enjoy it at the end. The other thing I thought was again really really satisfying in terms of payoff was we have the Nile, doing these micro hyperspace jumps, and it seems like there's really no way the Jedi and the Republic are going to be able to counter this. But Avar's power again comes into play, much like it did in the first section with her kind of snapping into all the Jedi to stop the Tabana gas canister, but she's able to use that power again and connect all the Jedi through this neural network and help them kind of predict where the Nile will appear in these micro jumps, and that's ultimately how they're able to defeat the Nile. I just thought Soule did a really good job of kind of seeding those ideas throughout the book and then ultimately paying them off in a really satisfying way at the end.
Yeah, and it also called back to that like Qui-Gon line of seeing things before they happen for Anakin. Like this was kind of at the highest degree level of that you're seeing hyperspace jumps before they happen to be able to predict those outcomes. I did want to go back to Loden and Bell real quick too on what you're saying there, Josh, that I think they implied Bell has another master as well at the end of that. That's like at least overseeing him at the moment.
I think that is.
Or am I mixing them up between?
No, you're right. I think Indira was also on Elfrona. She took over as his master.
Yeah. And I mean, it's disappointing because I think Loden and Bell's relationship is, maybe other than Avar and Elzar's relationship, the closest one of the bunch throughout it. And it is just like this awesome moment when he achieves that and saves this person. But the setup with Loden now being with Marchion is, I think, very cool. I mean, Loden definitely was my favorite Jedi character. Marchion is obviously, I think, the most interesting character, just because you don't know where he's going, and now that the two are together, you get the sense that Loden is sort of filling Mari's shoes soon, and that's his hope of what he's going to do with him. So his hope is really to enslave a master Jedi, and I'm very curious as to how he's going to execute that plan.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, Dan, because he does, as much as Mari contributes to the paths and whatnot, and he's keeping her alive and kind of isolated through these machines and other equipment. Marchion does repeatedly say, like, she could die tomorrow and that could be it. Like he is very aware that, anything could change and, they might be limited in terms of their paths. So yeah, having Loden as a potential way to sort of, continue on her legacy, by being captured and tortured is definitely an interesting thing that he might have at the back of his mind.
And Marchion also, I think, references in that scene with Loden that there's a history with Jedi somewhere in his past with his father, and something happened that destroyed their family or had some negative repercussions. So they continue to see these little mysteries in Marchion's past. So he's certainly up there with one of the more interesting characters in this story so far. I'm really going to be fascinated to see where he goes and what we learn about his backstory. We also learned that Marchion Ro is not his real name, which is pretty interesting.
It sort of seemed like Loden sensed that Jedi background too, or was a part of it potentially. Like it was a little unclear how they said that, but again with the audiobook, like it broke into like a tone that sounded more dreamlike right there, and maybe implied that he was like sensing this background story with the Jedi and his family. But definitely adding so many layers to that character. I mean, I really honestly, when we were talking about this 2 weeks ago, thought Marchion would maybe show up for a second at the end of the first book or something. Like I didn't think he'd be a main character, and I think he maybe had the most spotlight of anyone individually in the book, just because of the way they cover so many characters throughout it.
Yeah, and back to my point earlier about this really feeling like, I think the whole book more so felt like an origin story for the Nile than anything else. And they start out again as this kind of low-level group of marauders, and by the end we have Marchion kind of revealing his grand plan to some extent, and he has a Jedi Master imprisoned and control of all these forces. So in many ways, it feels like this is kind of just beginning, and there's a whole lot to happen. I'm very curious to see where the story goes from here, because I believe the next book that we get in February, I believe it's Into the Dark, but that I think they said takes place either before or simultaneous to the events of Light of the Jedi. But
Yeah, I think it takes
Marcia,
place concurrently with the Great
concurrent,
Disaster.
right?
How much before and after we'll get, I think, is
Yeah,
probably not like hugely impactful to stuff yet
sure.
beyond where this story goes, I'm sure.
But Martian at the end of this book makes it clear they're going to lay low for a bit. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious to see where we go from here. Does it lay low? I know, as we covered in the last episode, the Nile are only one of the threats that we're going to encounter
Mm-hmm.
in the High Republic. So maybe for a time, we're focused on different threats, and then the Nile will come back into the picture at a later date. But they did a really effective job of crafting some pretty cool villains who are, equipped with some pretty wild technology that poses a real threat to the public.
Yeah, I'm curious to see where it goes from here. Especially, I mean, it ended in a sense on a cliffhanger with Elzar's vision of the future in some regard, and we do know that some of the that the Nile aren't yet sort of the only antagonistic thing that's meant to appear within the High Republic, and there are some force using elements. I think it was force powered plants that are sort of like evil or
Trend gears,
yeah.
yeah.
So maybe that was something that was communing to him and sort of that vision that he had. Also interesting that like Bell, from Bell's actions sort of throughout this, that Bell was, promoted to out of a Padawan, that Elzar was granted the status of master and seemed to have a plan of, I know like Avar kind of said like, hey, you could hang around on the station and help out here. But he seemed to have a plan of sort of what he wanted to look into and research in terms of the Force or the world as a whole. So I'll be curious to see if what sort of his intentions that he had clearly in mind are somehow interlaced with sort of the visions that he had, that, he could be leading himself down a path of discovering something, or, that's evil, or, being led astray during this way. Now he's allowed to sort of freely explore that, which would be a really interesting foil to Avar Kriss, who, when you look at the title of Light of the Jedi, you kind of just embodies Avar Kriss, in a lot of ways.
Right.
Yeah, I also think we're really on the nose about the relationship in the epilogue. I mean, they were this close to crossing the line, I feel like, which I think better set up the tension after that nightmare kind of happens there for where this could go with that element added into it. His character to me, like, really just reminds me a lot of Dooku Jedi Lost, and which I'm excited because that writer is also a part of this, to just kind of see how some of that gets tied in. But you see that in Dooku, you see it in Qui-Gon, like you see it kind of repeated throughout that period. And I think Elzar could ultimately be the most interesting of the Jedi based on what they're showing us so far.
Yep.
I did want to hit just one other Jedi note, just because we mentioned it previously, but Skier lost his arm during this. So we knew that from the comic, that his arm was gone, but we didn't really know what exactly happened. But that was a pretty wild scene, and wild in the way that they like were in his head thinking about his arm just being severed and like not even worrying about it. Like he's really got this cool, like, tough facade of a Jedi.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Dan, because I did want to kind of touch on a little bit the kind of the question of how folks should approach the High Republic books. And I know in our last episode we were covering the live stream, one of the things that that we talked about and that the various creators had said is that, you don't necessarily have to read these books in order, and you kind of approach, things however you see fit. I found that, reading the comic first and then reading this, I would have much personally preferred to have read this first and then read the comic. There's so much, and I reread the comic today actually just to kind of refresh myself, but there's so much that's mentioned in the comic that takes place after Light of the Jedi that you really have no context for, no understanding absent this book. So I think at this point, my recommendation would be try to read them in order. It's probably not critical to you enjoying everything, but it certainly gives you a much deeper appreciation and context of what's going on and what's happened to this point in the story.
The only thing for me that helped with the comic was visualizing these things a bit. And like it is weird because you read lots of books that you'll never see any kind of visuals for, and it's totally fine. But for some reason with Star Wars, like every character you've read about, you've known them for so long that they're in your head, that I did find it a little bit difficult in this book with so many characters to not have those frames of reference. So like having seen Skier and Avar Kriss and things like that in the comic, like they were much clearer in my mind than some of the others that we hadn't really been introduced to yet.
That's true. That's a good point.
Which is why that kid's book actually I think is really good for the visual part of it.
Yeah,
I recommend reading that after you've read this, but it is really cool to see.
Yeah, I think it's worth reading that because it's literally like $4 or $5 on Amazon to buy it and be able to have a visualization. Otherwise, they did put out some like character art and concept art, so you can Google these characters and see them. But yeah, that I think the comic I do appreciate for having that, and the Great Jedi Rescue for that as well. Especially with like when I was reading the book initially, I kind of pictured the vectors a little more like Jedi starfighters, just in their like nimble and kind of like the way they describe them as a drift. I kind of saw them as almost like leaves flying, but when you see what they actually look like in the Great Jedi Rescue, their design is very different, and it makes sense because they're also still very aerodynamic, but they almost feel like like a skiff or like a ship, like an actual like ocean ship, like with almost like sails kind of as its wings and whatnot. So it definitely is interesting. I'll be excited for the first High Republic visual dictionary whenever we get something like that, just to see some of these things in the context of sort of what they're thinking of when they created them versus what our own mind's eyes are sort of developing them as.
Yeah. Totally. One other thing
with the ships. Oh, sorry, Josh. Just real quick with the vector ships. Something I meant to mention earlier was that whole initial phase felt a lot like Annihilation and Annihilation Conquest stuff from Marvel. And I think we talked about that a little bit previously in other videos, but I just thought it was really interesting that like one of the ships they literally named Nova in there, and that like lineup of the ships reminded me so much of the Nova Corps. And then once you saw the ship design, it had a lot more of that sleekness from that. You can really see throughout this book a lot of different times when they pulled from other pop culture to create new Star Wars pop culture, and I thought that was really neat.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just going to mention something to that point too, Dan, of how I think they are pulling in a lot of references and making little winks and nods to other pop culture. One of the things that we didn't get to dig into too much in this book, but in addition to Avar and Elzar, it's mentioned they have a third friend, Stellan Gios, who we know from the live stream event that he's going to be more of a central character in some of the subsequent books. But that totally gave me, shades of Harry Potter, Ron, Hermione, and Harry growing up together and having this lifelong friendship. So curious to get more context there, but yeah, just interesting how they're kind of pulling bits and pieces of other franchises and properties and kind of repurposing it in this book.
Yeah, I'm curious to learn more about Stellan. The concept art for him, like he looks so like classically like handsome knight, like very King Arthur type. But with the power levels of Avar and Elzar, you do wonder if he's more the Ron potentially of the group. Like, it's Not that Ron doesn't have his moments, but like I think it just seems to be setting up for that, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, yeah.
All the Ron fans are now gonna come after you, Dan.
Strictly from a magic level, that's all.
Yeah.
It would be kind of funny if they made like this classically handsome character just like terrible at using the Force or something.
Yeah. Well, guys, obviously we have a lot to say about this. It's pretty exciting, and we're going to do a lot more videos probably about parts of this book as well, and characters for sure from it, the events, and then we're going to be covering the other books really soon here. I think, we've got one more right now out to read, but the next one I think is only 2 weeks away. And we're going to continue to learn more about this new era, and I'm really excited about it. I'm more excited now than I was before. I think there's a lot of territory to cover.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's it's an exciting new era of Star Wars, and quite frankly, I didn't really know what to expect. We're entering an era where there's very little at least character connection to kind of the canon we're used to, and without really leaning on many references. We heard Yoda's name maybe a few times in this book, but generally it was all new characters, and I think Soule did a fantastic job of introducing these characters and making us care about those characters, and ultimately left us on a great cliffhanger of what's coming next. So I'm super excited to see where the story heads.
Yeah, I mean, just going into it, having heard, their light overview from the live stream and some of the materials that come out of Head, and then even more so just going off like the cover art of this book, I kind of expected more of a, I don't know, slow and almost like regal introduction to the High Republic. And I think you get a sense of that's the world that exists, and they do a good job of conveying that. But they also very quickly jump into, the day-to-day of the Jedi, this great disaster. I mean, kicks off literally essentially on page 1, and then do a great job of sort of introducing, the Nile and Martian Row and all these different elements. I mean, it definitely is not a brief book by any stretch. It's a pretty lengthy thing, but it's also at the same time a pretty quick read and a very entertaining read. And I think it's of the sort of post Disney canon book releases that they put out, it's definitely one of my favorites that I've read so far, for sure.
Definitely. All right, everyone. I guess our catchphrase for these are "We are the Republic." We're no longer "This is the way," but
are we now the Nihil?
Yeah, I'm going to the Nile.
You guys are going too far. But everyone have a great week, and we will check back in soon with more High Republic content.
All righty.
See ya.